When I was 12 years old, my parents told me that I was adopted because they wanted me to be old enough to fully understand what being adopted meant. I have no other siblings and both of my parents are in their 80s. My mother told me that no adoption agency would consider them because they were in their 50s when they attempted to adopt a child. She told me that they weren't particular about the age, race, or the gender of the child either. Seemingly out of nowhere, an adoption agency called Stallions Incorporated had responded to my parents' application and wanted to set up a meeting. The company told my parents they had a 3-month-old girl available. My parents jumped at the opportunity and met with the agency. The company was located in an old mansion in Manhattan that has since been torn down in order to build a high-rise. My parents told me that things were completely different before the internet took off and that you really couldn't do much in the way of background checks or research into a company. The only real resources you could utilize were the Better Business Bureau, word of mouth, or you had to do your own research. The issue that I'm running into now is that my birth certificate is fake. The adoption agency told my parents that I was born at St. Joseph's Hospital, and after doing countless hours of research and interviews, I determined that my birth certificate was not from that hospital, and in fact didn't originate from any hospital. The biggest piece of evidence that I had was when I met with the director of St. Joseph's neonatal department, who retired after working 40 years at the hospital, where she told me that without a doubt that the birth certificate didn't originate from the hospital. There was really no way for my parents to know this because finding uniformity in birth certificates up until recently just didn't exist. I even submitted my DNA to Ancestry where there were 0 matches and I wasn't linked to any family tree. The story from the Stallions Incorporated adoption agency sounds really sketchy today, where they told my parents that the hospital's social worker gave them the baby from a young mother who didn't want to have children, where the director of neonatal services at St. Joseph's told me that they had their own adoption network that was affiliated with the Catholic Health Network. I posted the photograph on every social media platform and I waited for weeks, and the only responses that I received was from people who worked at other adoption agencies who told me they had never heard of the company. My parents swore they saw the Stallions ad in the Yellow Pages, so I looked online for a copy of the Yellow Pages. I did find a vintage Yellow Pages Manhattan copy, and sure enough, after spending $100 and waiting 2 weeks, I saw the name and the phone number of the company, which really didn't help me too much. I had hit a dead end. I had so many unanswered questions that I thought would never be answered. I asked my parents about how I was as a baby, and I was surprised by their response. They told me that I basically lacked a temperament. My mother had bought every self-help book for new mothers, and I just didn't fit in anywhere in how a baby should behave. My parents didn't know if I had learning delays or if I had been abused, but I just lacked certain innate characteristics. My mother told me that she couldn't rely on me to cry to know that I needed something because I just didn't cry. I didn't smile either, so my mother had to manually move my lips upwards in order to teach me how to smile. She told me that I was just a piece of clay that came with nothing else. I eventually learned everything that other babies were born with, but hearing my mother explain this to me definitely made me wonder more where I came from. Later on, I had no issues in school, and in fact, I had my choice of what Ivy League school I wanted to attend. After more than a year, I got a message on Facebook from the photograph that I had posted from the Stallions agency. The person told me that she was certain that one of the ladies that was photographed in the picture was her neighbor when she was growing up. She told me that she has passed away, but her husband was still living at the same house. She gave the address and told me that they were limited in understanding English and they were from Austria. I didn't want to be intrusive and knock on the guy's door, so I sent him a simple letter basically stating my name and phone number, and I referenced his wife, Hildred Muller. I waited for weeks and I didn't get a response, so I reluctantly drove to Woodhaven, New York and Queens and knocked on his door. He answered the door and I could tell he knew who I was already before I told him. He had an old world hospitality about himself and invited me into his house. His house was like a museum. Nothing had been updated since the 1940s. There was no TV and just one of those big radios that I think was being powered by vacuum tubes. He served me tea from a silver-plated platter. I was just amazed being in the house and experiencing firsthand his long-forgotten traditions. He spoke with a thick Bavarian accent, but he could understand what I was saying. He was really trying to deflect all of my questions. He kept trying to allude to the point of letting sleeping dogs lie, and if I was doing well, then not to do anything that would jeopardize that. After being extremely insistent, he finally gave me some information. He told me about how his wife and him were young children during the war, and the aftermaths of the war were worse than the actual war itself. He told me that he met his wife at a communist-run orphanage when they were 14. Him and his wife were gifted musicians, which opened a lot of doors for them that nearly no other kids were privy to. Being a musician was a difficult occupation to make money, so they both took double majors in college in chemistry. His wife did a lot of research on evolutionary development of mammals and was well published in most mainstream magazines. Eventually, she caught the eye of an emerging geneticist who was working on primates, where she worked with primates for over a decade and then was disappointed because she felt that she learned everything that she could possibly learn about the genetic makeup of primates from an evolutionary standpoint. So she started her own laboratory where she took her research to the next level with working with humans. Placentas were really easy to get because oftentimes they would just be incinerated or thrown away in biohazard waste. Essentially, she learned the DNA makeup of a human inside and out, and like a car, how you could take something out to add an update that is better. Essentially, she learned the same thing about humans. All of this stuff was considered illegal, so you won't find any of this work in any kind of journals. Mr. Muller went on to talk about Dolly, the cloned sheep, which he considered a mere joke considering how advanced his wife's work was at the time. Mr. Muller told me eventually his wife's secret got out and she had to destroy all of her research. He said, "If you see my house, there are no computers and nothing that could be linked to the work my wife did. So when the FBI came knocking on our door, they literally left with zero evidence." He went on to explain the stereotypes that him and his wife faced just by their accents in the region of Europe where they were born. He said that everyone still thinks that they would naturally do evil human experiments because of our association to the Axis during the war. But most people don't realize that I only have vague memories of my parents. I was essentially indoctrinated into communism and not fascism. I was left completely stunned sitting in this hand-carved wooden chair in this old man's house who was well into his 80s. The teacup was perched up and my elbow was at a 90-degree angle. My head was spinning from trying to follow everything he was saying with his Bavarian accent. When I knocked on his door, I was just expecting, "Yeah, she worked at that agency for a few years and the agency went out of business, so she went too." I had no inkling that I was going to be told this information, and the main question remained, why was he telling me this? So I said, "Mr. Muller, you told me more information than I was expecting. Why?" He responded, "My wife was a great person. We have no children and I would die at any time. If you didn't knock on my door, then I would have taken this to my grave." I responded, "But why did you tell me all of this information?" He said, "As I told you when you knocked on the door, if you are doing well, then let sleeping dogs lie." I responded, "Were you insinuating something about me when you told me your wife's story?" He told me to carefully remove the wood panel from the back of the radio, then move it towards me. So I did what he said and exposed the back of the radio towards him. Then he told me to remove a section of the old glass vacuum tubes, which I did. Then he told me to slide the empty metal casing towards me, which exposed a small wooden box. He told me to open the wooden box. I opened the box and there were pictures of a newborn infant on top. He said, "That baby was supposed to be our baby, but the baby would have been labeled a monster, so we started a faux adoption agency where only one child was adopted." Then he said, "Keep looking through the photographs." I started to cry as I flipped through the photographs because they were of me from a baby until about the age of 14, which was when his wife died. He started crying along with and said that he was sorry. He said, "If you tell anybody about this, then you'll be looked at as a Frankenstein." I really was at a loss of words. I thought maybe my parents were a high school fling or something, but as I pieced everything together, I figured I was just a combination of a bunch of different DNA strands from different placentas, which would explain my lack of being born with distinct family traits. I got up to leave his house and I hugged him. He told me to hold on to this information that he told me until I got older, where I could better decide if it was in my best interest or my kids' best interest to let it be known. I am now in a postdoctorate program studying genetic engineering, where modern scientists are grappling with solutions that my lab mother had figured out decades ago.